Malachi chapter 3, verse 6 says, God's nature does not change. Further, we read in Numbers chapter 23, verse 19, where it says, God is not a man, nor can he become a man. So we read in Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, that God's nature does not change, that God doesn't change. And we read in Numbers chapter 23, verse 19, that God cannot become a man or the Son of Man. So, what does Jesus identify himself as? Jesus is called a man by Peter in Acts chapter 2, verse 22. And Peter was a eyewitness. Peter was Jesus' closest disciple. So, and Jesus himself identifies himself as the Son of Man in the Gospel of Matthew, Luke, etc. So, if Jesus is a man according to Peter, and if Jesus is identifying himself as a Son of Man, which implies his humanity in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that means that Jesus cannot be God, or at least Jesus can't be the God of the Old Testament, because Malachi chapter 3 verse 6 says God's nature doesn't change. So Jesus cannot come, God cannot come 500 years later and become a man and become the Son of Man, or become a human man, as Christians believe Jesus was, because that contradicts Malachi chapter 3 verse 6, and that contradicts Numbers chapter 23. So Malachi chapter 3 verse 6 tells us it's impossible for God's nature to change 500 years later, or hundreds of years later in New Testament times, and become, a human man God, because Christians believe Jesus is a man God. He's the God man on earth. But this contradicts Malachi 3:6, that God's nature cannot change. So God can't come hundreds of years later and become a human and dwell with us, because that contradicts Numbers, and it contradicts Malachi. So the Old Testament theology completely contradicts, Christian theology, that Jesus became a God man, or that Christians say that Jesus is God. So the Old Testament contradicts the New Testament. So you can't have it both ways. Either the Old Testament's right, or Christian theology is right, or they're both wrong, or they contradict, or at best they contradict each other. I like to say they contradict each other.